Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm chatting with Mike McGlone from Bloomberg. In today's interview, we discuss Donald Trump's new presidency and what it means for commodities, specifically gold. We also get into Bitcoin, where Mike thinks it could be heading, and Mike gives us an outlook for 2025. All right, everybody, enjoy the interview. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, hello, Steve. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
So it's been a while since we've last chatted, and I think that a lot of stuff has happened in the markets since our last conversation. I know we used to talk quite a bit about Bitcoin years ago, and since then, Bitcoin's done quite well. I'm curious what your read right now on the crypto market is. Do you think Bitcoin still has some life in it? Do you think that it's maybe getting a little bit too heavy here as we approach a $2 trillion market cap, and every dollar that goes into it's obviously going to get heavier and heavier? What's your read right now on Bitcoin?
More of the latter. I think 100,000 is a significant threshold for Bitcoin. Sure, it can get to 120, 130, but I think a normal retracement gets to 70, maybe even 50. And the bottom line for it is you have to ask yourself, is it going to get better than last year for Bitcoin to go up? We had, first of all, the ETS, which, some of us waited for those for a decade, the halving, the record-setting stock market, the $100,000 threshold, and the number one most significant pivot of all time is that antagonist herd zealot, Mr. Trump, getting elected. That's quite significant. So the question is, what really pushes it higher next year? I think the number one factor is some kind of strategic Bitcoin reserve, most notably the U.S., maybe in the rest of parts of the world. But otherwise, I published recently, there's Bitcoin and 2.4 million wannabes, maybe not just wannabes, but competitors. There's an unlimited supply of cryptos, and there's things like Dogecoin at $50 billion and Shiba Inu at $14 billion. Just put that in context, the total cost of the wildfires, the fires in California right now is like $30 billion. They're just silly, expensive valuations, a lot of these cryptos. And it's on the back of the pretty significant rapid appreciation of stock markets led by the U.S. But the thing is now is our chief equity strategist, Gina Martin Adams, has turned bearish. She's been spot on the bull market. And we all know the equity market's historically expensive. And Bitcoin's typically three times the volatility of the S&P 500. So I think the risks are it trades lower with just a pullback in risk assets. The way I look at it right now, if you're buying Bitcoin, you're basically taking on about three times the beta of the S&P 500. And maybe you'll get lucky and stocks will go down and Bitcoin will go up. But so far, the history of that is not good.
Now, you mentioned some of those other coins that are out there, and there's a story that I think a lot of people have taken quite a bit of interest in the last couple of months, and that's the Hawk Tuah coin, where we had the famous Hawk Tuah girl, Haley Welch, I believe her name is, got involved with a group who created the Hawk coin, which went public, and I think it got up to, it was a couple $100 million market cap right out of the gate. It didn't last very long. There was a whole bunch of money in fees collected, and there was some talk of there being sort of a sniper in there that bought up a bunch of the float and took it up and then sold it on the way down. I'm curious here what your viewpoint on just like what it means for the crypto industry when we see these things happen. Do you think that there's going to be any sort of regulatory blowback on the team that took it public? What do you think that this says right now about the state of the crypto investor?
It's very much akin to what I remember from 1999, speculative risk assets getting too expensive, 2007, what I've read about in 1929, what I remember reading about in 1973, 74, 1987. There's massive speculative excesses in the space. You just described one. It's wonderful to be able to make money speculating. But at some point, there's always it always comes to some mean reversion, some normalization. And that's why I just point out there's unlimited supply of cryptos. You can just create them and make money right away. It's wonderful in an environment. There's massive money and wealth being created. So last year, the S&P 500 added about $13 trillion of net worth or market capitalization, which was almost 50% of U.S. GDP. It's almost the highest ever. That's got to keep going. And at some point, it just gets too expensive, which some of the dates I mentioned to you, and I think we're near that stage. And some of the good indications for that are what's happening in China, second largest economy, is basically imploding, completely dependent on fiscal monetary stimulus. It's 10-year note yield at 1.64. To me, it's indicative where probably the rest of the world's 10-year note yields are going to go. They're just turning Japanese. It's not just China. It's Indonesia, I hear. I mean, Japan has still got very low rates. The rest of the Europe's got major deflationary issues, and they have to face U.S. Tariffs. But to me, the bottom line is the crypto space, Bitcoin. I thought it was really attractive at 10,000 and made the call for 100,000. I fell off the boat a little bit last year, but now that we're at 100,000, just don't see it rapidly and easily appreciating and adding another zero, which was my focus back in October of 2020 at 10,000. And the key things have really flipped. It's the hubris and the bravado of people who have been bullish and long, people like Michael Saylor, the lessons I learned in the trading pits, working with customers on the phone and running my own money and the hedge fund, everything is never tempt the market guides. And a lot of these people are really tempting the market gods in a big way. So I overall view as cryptos as the leading indicator of speculation. I do agree with the premise of defining definable diminishing supply, increasing demand and adoption for Bitcoin. But then there's Ethereum, XRP, BNP, Dogecoin, there's gazillions of other ones. And that's the problem. I look at precious metals and gold, and I see there's only three competitors really to gold: silver, platinum, and palladium. And I've been watching that Bitcoin gold ratio forever, and it's still right about 36 ounces of gold to one Bitcoin, the same as that 2021 peak. Yet stock market started and rolled back over. So I'm still tilting towards gold, particularly if we have a risk-off environment that's a little more deflationary. And right now, here's the problem. The Fed stopped easing. Why they stopped easing? Because there's just too much wealth in the system. It's just silly to expect the stock market to go up that much, 2 times GDP, and have inflation really fall. And that's where we are. We're stuck at the moment. And the question is, where do we go next? So I'm painting kind of a bearish picture. I've been early on this, but still early on gold. I still think gold has a lot more upside. And I really worry that it's going to outpace Bitcoin this year. And I said that last year, and good news, I was wrong. But the S&P 500 did appreciate 25%. What if we get a year when just, God help us, drops 8 to 10%? That's not factored in anybody's model. And at some point, we'll get that. We haven't had a down year since 2011. And, we're overdue for some back in film. Like I said, it's happening in the rest of the world, particularly happening in China. And how long can the U.S. be the shining star and get away from that? So it'll be a good question what happens this year. But we see a lot of indicators going that way. And that is, look at bond yields in the U.S. They just keep creeping higher. That's stealing capital from equities.
So one of the things you just mentioned there is tariffs. Now you're talking to me, a Canadian, and as you can imagine, Donald Trump's recent talk of tariffs, 25% on both Canada and Mexico, is all over our news headlines. I'm curious, do you think that this is something that the Canadian government should be taking seriously? Do you think that Trump's just kind of using it as a starting point for negotiation? What's your read on Trump and tariffs?
Everybody should take everything he says seriously. This is an emboldened human being who's been reelected, attempted assassination attempt. No one thought he could really make it back, and he did. Do not underestimate this human being, based on 2 books. One book was No Trade is Free by Robert Lighthizer, his former trade advisor, and General McMaster, his former national security advisor. The headline of his book was At War with Ourselves. Pointed out Trump, if he gets reelected, he's going to hire and have nothing but zealots on his team, complete devotion, loyalty to him. And that's happening. So the threats, I think, are legitimate. And think of it this way. Now he's at the point of thinking of his legacy. He's got 2 years to the midterm. He's got 4 years. He's already pretty much an old man, and then he's gone. He's history. He's going to be, what's my legacy? Did I make the world different? Did I make it better? Why waste time? Get this over with right away. And that was one of the mistakes he made last time. He trusted the Chinese. They pushed back and treated him very poorly. The U.S. trade inbound started to improve a little bit. But here's some facts about trade. This is something that really resonated for me, having been in the business for almost 40 years. I remember being on the phones with my clients, some Canadians, in the trading pitch in Chicago, and we all would say there's no such thing as free trade when you're the world's largest demand pull economy. There's no single economy a country can offer you similar reciprocity in trade. And that's finally, U.S. is finally figuring that out. So our trade surplus, a deficit's about $1 trillion, about that. It's been growing for decades. It's about time we rebalance that. And the only way to really do it is with tariffs, really, because negotiation doesn't work. I mean, I just think the U.S. trying to negotiate with France. So it's a free trade. Well, France already charges 26% on U.S. wine, and U.S. charges like nothing on there. Well, we got to protect our are commodities, but they offer maybe 60 million people what kind of GDP. And yes, they have a European Union, but there's how many? 27 different languages. There's nothing even close. So it's going to fix some of those imbalances in the world. But the key bottom line is from that book, Robert Lighthizer, he's going to come out hard. And unless there's immediate negotiations, just throw on the tariffs. But that's the key thing about it. He can do that right away with presidential orders. Everything else he's talking about, like regulation and lower taxes, that typically involves acts of Congress. And yes, he does have majorities, but they're very slim. And most people, I think, in Congress now are thinking, okay, what's the post-Trump era, which will be the next big trade?
So, what commodities do you think win in a Trump presidency?
Gold. So I'm still bullish gold. Um, Number one, and particularly if we have a little bit of reversion upward in U.S. stock market volatility, which is almost a 10-year low, a little bit downward in the prices of equities, which is a direct correlation to Bitcoin. Maybe we'll get a little bit less competition for gold from Bitcoin, but I'm still quite bullish gold, and that's kind of what scares me a little bit. I don't know anybody who isn't, so that's always kind of a problem. But so I'm still bullish gold. I think it's bad for all commodities, particularly because the U.S. has a pretty significant glut of energy with Canada. I mean, U.S. and Canada together have a supply surplus of about 6 million barrels a day of crude and liquid fuels. To put that in context, in 2008, there was a 10 million barrel a day deficit, and definitely a glut of grains and food and energy and LNG. And if there's a trade war, that glut's just going to grow. But also, he also promised lower energy prices. So I don't see anything but things like crude oil and even natural gas to continue what they normally do in history and just go lower. I mean, we create more with less every day. We're still using a lot of natural gas, but less and less petroleum. So those prices should go lower. Grain prices should continue their downward trajectories. Yeah, if they'll get to the break-even cost. In corn, that's around just below $4 a bushel. And WTI crude oil, that's just below $56 a barrel. But gold, I still continue to see appreciating. And that's most notably when, I didn't say if, we have some normal backup in the U.S. stock market. I mean, it's 2.2 times GDP. That's the most in 100 years. It's versus the rest of the world versus most metrics. It's the highest ever versus the rest of the world, but versus most metrics, most people are using the 97th percentile of expensive. And that's why I think you got to look for alternatives and still gold. So I watch very closely that S&P 500 divided by gold ratio. It takes about 2.2 ounces of gold per S&P 500. That's been trickling down since the peak around 2.6 in 2021. And I'm afraid it's just going to continue lower, unfortunately. And here's the key thing I'll end with is last year, was the best. It's such an awesome year for the S&P 500 total return of 25%. Well, gold increased 27%. That ain't good for when the rock beats stocks.
Are there any bubbles that you sort of forecast happening? I know that we've had this little bit of a run with some of the quantum computing stocks. We had names like Rigetti, D-Wave, and IonQ. Obviously, that was started out with Google announcing the Willow chip. It seems like we just had CES 2025, and the big talk there was humanoid robots, where Jensen Huang from NVIDIA hopped up on stage, and he must have had like 24 humanoid robots behind him talking about how NVIDIA is working on chips for all these different humanoids. Uh, are you watching in terms of the equity markets of any potential bubbles that may be emerging?
So I don't watch equities as close as you do on broad commodities. I've got colleagues who do that, so I don't step on their toes a lot. But I do really subscribe to the views of Jeff Booth, that great Canadian who wrote the book The Price of Tomorrow. I was just listening to one of his latest podcasts. How the technology is inherently deflationary. It's going to pressure all major commodity prices and create deflation and create value for people who are invested, like some of the specific investments in companies you mentioned. I fully expect that to continue. And I don't see what stops it. And it's going to accelerate, which means over time, commodities always underperform a broad basket of any type of equities. But the key things from right now, it's from my colleague's equity strategist, Gina Martin Adams, is tech earnings expectations are way too high. I mean, they're typically what you happen in decent bull markets. You just keep raising the bar until it goes down, until it reverts. And that's where we are in terms of equities. So, and that's to me is why that gold S&P 500 gold ratio has been declining. I mean, gold's actually beating it. So I'm uh, very much concerned about the overall valuation. But as far as the bubble, to me, the first place I go is cryptos. I mean, okay, I get Dogecoin. Elon Musk loves it, but it reached over $64 billion market cap, which is more than BNY Mellon, and BNY Mellon has $19.1 billion of revenue estimated for next year. Maybe that drops a little bit, but I think we're going to look back from the future and say, yeah, that was like 1929. That's silliness. You things in these joke coins are an example of massive bubblicious speculation. And we're going to look back and say that was silly. The question's when did you finally pop it? And that's why I view when people say to me, well, Bitcoin's different. I'm like, yeah, I know, but has much higher correlation to Dogecoin than it does the S&P 500, which is still very high. It's actually in a 100-day basis, it's around 0.5. It's the highest on the way up in its entire history.
So it sounds like, if I'm kind of interpreting your take on Bitcoin correctly, you've been bullish on it in the past because you sort of
Yeah.
see what the chart looks like, what the volume looks like. But at some point, you feel like the Bitcoin's probably gonna lose its luster, and people are gonna finally come to terms with the fact that the intrinsic value of it's actually zero.
Yeah, I don't want to I want to be clear.
On,
I think
on
it's
a long enough timeline.
well, so long-term, big picture, I get it. Definable diminishing supply, increasing the demand and adoption, price must go up over time. But it did go up. It went to a major threshold. I think the risks is it goes down. I don't want to be clear. I want to be clear about that. And if I'm wrong, people know who to blame. I just have to take a view. My job is to take a view. Here's the view. Particularly if the U.S. stock market goes down. Particularly if U.S. yields go down and gold continues to appreciate. To me, that's the next big trade. And Bitcoin was the last big trade. The problem I see now with the space is just way too expensive. It reached the major threshold, and then just way too much speculation into those 2.4 million crypto wannabes. The key thing I want to point out, and I pointed out from the very beginning, is the technology is overwhelming. I just click on coinmarketcap.com. I sort by volume, and number one on top is always Tether. It's typically double the volume of Bitcoin. Tether is the US dollar. And it was delightful to see our fearless leader finally tilt over to realizing that this space is nothing but good for the US because it went to the US it's to the dollar, its base layer, and it means a lot of investment in treasuries. It was silly back when he was first president to push back on cryptos, but now he's come around. The key thing I think that Bitcoin people have to look forward to now is the potential for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But what if we don't get that? I know promises from politicians are not a reason you want to use to buy cryptos.
Let me give you a little bit of pushback on that because I can't wrap my
Please.
head around it. What's strategic about Bitcoin, right? Like, we think about the
Yeah.
strategic petroleum reserve or whatever it's called, which the U.S. used to have. I think Biden's just about depleted it since Russia invaded Ukraine, and that made sense because you wanted to have a supply of oil in case things got particularly bad. But when are we ever going to need Bitcoin? What's the purpose of having a strategic Bitcoin reserve other than pure speculation?
There you go. That you answered the question. I agree with you. We had let's put it back. I agree with you. The last thing the U.S. needs to do is support the U.S. dollar. Historically, the biggest problem with the U.S. dollar has been too much strength. I mean, one good example is the Plaza Accord in 1985. I remember that one well. I was a student in France. But the key thing I want to point out, you mentioned the strategic petroleum reserve. There was a reason for that. It was started in basically the 70s to cover about 90 days of net U.S. imports. Now the U.S. is a net exporter, almost 3 to 4 million barrels a day, including Canada, 6 million barrels a day. It's no longer needed. Yes, we needed some. It depleted a lot of it. I remember writing about it. It was one of the best trades ever by a president. He basically grossed $20 billion and still didn't buy back a lot. He's bought back some of it. Right now it's 394 million barrels. I mean, okay, the peak was around almost 800 million barrels, but it's just not needed except to cover things like hurricanes. Because the biggest problem is if we have some kind of major trade war and there's a war overseas, if they can't get U.S. crew, they got a problem, not us, not U.S. and Canada. So, but Bitcoin reserve, no, it's silly. Your question answers my reservation about it. It's a promise that a politician made that helped him get elected, and now he is elected. What's he going to do about it? I just think it's silly. It's a highly volatile, speculative digital asset, which is what Bitcoin is. It's 3 times the volatility of gold and Bitcoin. I've been saying for almost a decade now, it's kind of irresponsible to hold gold, investment gold, without some Bitcoin in that space, but on a volatility weighted basis. So here's what's happened. We've had this significant inflows in Bitcoin ETFs and outflows for 4 years in a row now in gold ETFs. Now, I think that's going to reverse next year, which is good for gold. But the market cap of Bitcoin ETFs between 120 and 130 billion. It's on a risk adjusted basis. It's actually higher than gold's market cap in ETFs, around 220 billion. So we've already got there in terms of ETFs, but people say it's different. And then I just point out the lessons I've learned in all these kind of things about assets that don't have earnings is you're never going to get the RAs to buy a lot of an investment, because the whole lessons of investing in history are compounded returns and earnings. And you don't have that in gold and Bitcoin and all those, most cryptocurrencies, with the exception of most notable Ethereum has a little bit. But the Bitcoin reserve, just by the premise of your question, that's why I'm saying, well, that's what people are focusing on. That's part of the reason I'm bearish Bitcoin. But you have to point that out. If it does happen, it's going to be bullish for the price.
So fair enough. It's completely ridiculous, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen.
Well, if you completely ridiculous, yeah, exactly. And I'm worried. I'm so worried that Mr. Gensler is going to be able to say, "I told you so." I don't. I think in the short term he might be able to, when we see the purge. I didn't say if, in some of these silly cryptos. Yeah, it's just we have gold reserves. They're fine. The problem with the dollar typically is too much strength, not the need to have for a reserve. But one thing that there's no zealot like a convert. I converted to Bitcoin a long time ago, and part of it was when I read the book by Saifedean Ammous, The Bitcoin Standard, and he did predict central banks would start accumulating gold, and still seems to be going that way. I don't. I'm just concerned about how it's happening with the president doing to keep the price go up, because the people who got him elected. It's basically kind of a Faustian bargain.
Well, Mike, thanks very much for hopping on here today. For our audience, if they want more of your commentary, where can they go to?
On your show first. Thanks for having me back. It's good to talk to you. I'm on the Bloomberg terminal, on X at Mike McGlone 11, and LinkedIn. If people want to get on my distribution list, just send me a message and I will happy to add them.
And you are the first person I think I've ever talked to who referred to Twitter as X. So I guess that's going to be a thing now, and everybody's going to start doing it around me. I was waiting for the moment where somebody would refer to it as X, and
It's hard
just
to
happened.
do. But when it's one of the things I learned in my 60 years or so on the planet is I just really respect successful people, whether I like them or not. And Mr. Trump has been very successful, and Mr. Musk seems to know a
Absolutely.
lot more about this thing than I do. And if he wants to call it X, fine, yes, sir. But oh well, we'll go with it and see how it works.
Well, Mike, thanks very much for hopping on. Let's do this again in a few months.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this interview, please smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thanks for watching, everyone.